The stories and examples discussed in our previous episode all belong to periods that predate Old English. So, what exactly is English? Before we can explore the internal history of the English language, we must first answer this question. In the second episode, we will talk about Old English under foreign language influence. Many linguistic works use a tree-like genealogical diagram to illustrate the evolution and relationships within the Indo-European language family. Proto-Indo-European split into the proto-branches of the major Indo-European subfamilies. Proto-Germanic is generally thought to have existed from roughly 500 BCE to around 200 CE. Within this framework, the West Germanic branch of the Germanic family gradually gave rise to the early ancestral forms of German, English, and Dutch. Modern English ultimately descends from one of these early forms, Old English. If we trace its history back far enough, we find that wherever English is spoken today, whether in Sydney, in Seattle, or in Toronto, its ultimate origins lie in Anglo-Saxon England. However, this leads us to another question. Where did the Anglo-Saxons themselves come from? Roughly speaking, speakers of Anglo-Saxon English began arriving in Britain early in the 5th century from the lands across the North Sea, primarily the coastal regions between present-day Denmark and the Netherlands, together with their immediate hinterlands. The Anglo-Saxon settlers came from three major tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Angles correspond to the Anglian groups, the Saxons to the Saxon groups, and the Jutes to the early population of Kent. Over time, the invaders steadily expanded the territories under their control until these encompassed all areas except the western and northern highlands. Viewed on a broader geographical and chronological scale, the language spoken by these invaders was a dialect of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family, the language that would eventually develop into modern English. English inherited many linguistic features and sound changes from Proto-Germanic. When the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain in the 5th century, they came into contact with the local Celtic tribes. The Celts referred to their Germanic conquerors indiscriminately as Saxons. Early Latin writers, following Celtic usage, generally call the Germanic inhabitants of England Saxones and the land Saxonia. Over time, Angli and Anglia became the standard terms used in Latin texts. Writers in the vernacular, however, never referred to their language as anything other than English. Although the word derives from the name of the Angles, it is employed without distinction for the language spoken by all the invading tribes. Throughout its 1500-year history in England, English has undergone continuous change. Nevertheless, within this long process of development, the history of the language is commonly divided into three major periods. Each period is characterized by certain broad features and by particular types of linguistic change. The years 450 to 1150 are known as the Old English period. This stage is often described as the period of full inflections because for most of its duration, the endings of nouns, adjectives, and verbs remained more or less intact. The period from 1150 to 1500 is referred to as Middle English. During these centuries, the inflectional system inherited from Old English was greatly reduced, and many of its inflectional endings began to collapse. Accordingly, this stage is often called the period of leveled inflections. The English spoken since 1500 is known as Modern English. By the time we reach this stage, most of the original inflectional system had disappeared altogether, leading us to describe it as the period of lost inflections. However, As a Germanic language, Old English was by no means completely uniform. Not only does the language of the earliest written records around 700 CE differ from that of later literary texts, but regional variation was also considerable. We can distinguish four principal dialects of the Old English period: West Saxon, Kentish, Mercian, and Northumbrian. Of these, the only dialect that survives in substantial textual quantity is West Saxon, the dialect of the West Saxon kingdom in the southwest. Nearly all extant Old English literature has been preserved in manuscripts copied in this region. With the rise of the West Saxon kingdom, the West Saxon dialect acquired, to some degree, the status of a literary standard. Owing to this development, and to the sheer abundance of surviving material, it has become the primary basis for the study of Old English. In fact, the differences between Old English and Modern English involve spelling and pronunciation, the lexicon, and the grammar. The pronunciation of Old English words often differs to some extent from that of their modern counterparts. In particular, the long vowels have undergone substantial change. Thus, the Old English word stan is the same word as modern English stone, but the vowel is different. Such similar correspondences can also be clearly observed in these words. Old English inflections were also far more complex than those of modern English. A typical noun declension table such as this one gives us a glimpse into the structural complexity of Old English. In terms of language contact and borrowing, the Old English period offers relatively limited evidence of Celtic influence. During their encounters with the invading Germanic peoples, the Celtic tribes were largely enslaved, exterminated, or driven to the fringes of Britain. As a result, traces of Celtic languages in English are thought to be minimal. Celtic loanwords in English are primarily confined to place names and terms relating to natural features. For example, cum in Duncombe, Holcombe, and Winchcombe, and Tor in Torbay, Torcross, Torhill, and Torside. The term Tor is generally believed to have entered Old English from Latin, with Celtic acting as an intermediary. Owing to cultural and religious contact with the Romans, Latin also left a considerable imprint on Old English. These influences can be divided into three main categories. The first consists of borrowings that entered English through the languages of the European continent. The second, as noted earlier, comprises items transmitted through Celtic intermediaries. And the third derives from the spread of Christianity in Britain. By the late 8th century, Viking raids began along the northeastern coast of England, and within a century the Vikings had established a sustained presence and settled in various parts of the country. Their arrival introduced numerous Scandinavian place names into England, many of which can be identified by their characteristic endings, such as Thorpe, By, and Thwaite. These place names are concentrated primarily in Yorkshire, the East Midlands, and East Anglia. In addition, Old English adopted a number of other words from the Old Norse spoken by the Vikings. One of the most recognizable features is the consonant cluster sk. In Old English, this cluster had earlier undergone palatalization and developed into she, whereas in the Scandinavian languages, it retained its hard sk pronunciation. As a result, native Old English words such as ship, shall, and fish appear with esh in modern English, while words borrowed from Scandinavian typically preserve the sk sound: sky, skin, scrape, bask, whisk. Of course, once Old English gave way to Middle English, many additional changes took place. In our next episode, we will turn to the story of the transition from Middle English to Modern English. See you next time.